Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm your co-host for today's show. In the program today, we will seek to unpack the place of young people in Africa's future. While we often see the continent's youth at the forefront of the fight for democracy and accountability, they also face being marginalized in an era of democratic backsliding. Young people, too, have also led decidedly anti-democratic campaigns, including military coups going back decades in Ghana and the Gambia, but also more recently in Guinea and Burkina Faso. Recent Afrobarometer data also revealed a startling truth. Young people in Africa today are less likely to support democracy than their older counterparts. What then can we learn from successful youth movements in Zambia and Nigeria, for example? And can they provide a workable or inspiring blueprint for elsewhere on the continent? We'll get into all of this and much more in just a bit. But first, as a way of refreshing your memory, the Resistance Bureau focuses on the major threats to human rights in Africa and worldwide, while shining a light on the enduring struggle for freedom. This program features the leaders at the forefront of these critical fights, the activists and human rights defenders, politicians, journalists, as well as leaders and academics, and we seek to build solidarity and networks among them. Indeed, what you see on the show today is only a small portion of the overall work being done. It is in this spirit that we are joined today by a stellar panel of youth leaders. First, we have Maxwell Dlamini, a youth leader from Swaziland, Africa's last absolute monarchy, in which all forms of democracy have essentially been criminalized. Because of this, Maxwell has been repeatedly arrested and persecuted by royal authorities, but this has not stopped him from being a vocal civic leader and from leading the work of the Swaziland Youth Congress. We are also joined by Joseph Kalimbwe, one of the most popular youth activists in Southern Africa today, both on social media and on the ground, where he advocates for democratic reforms and accountability. Recently, he played a central role in mobilizing the youth vote ahead of Zambia's consequential 2021 elections that saw the defeat of President Lungu's authoritarian government. Third, we have with us Honorable Joanna Momembe, the youngest member of parliament in Zimbabwe. She is also a youth national executive member of the Citizens Coalition for Change, the country's main opposition party. Like other leaders on today's program, she has faced routine persecution for being involved in opposition politics, but nevertheless continues to speak out and works to address the many injustices that prevail in her country. And finally, our discussant today, who will be joining us a bit later on, is Cynthia Mbamalu, an accomplished human rights and gender advocate. She's the co-founder of several innovative initiatives that support young people to run for public office, and is perhaps best known for her efforts around the Not Too Young to Run campaign, which eventually became an act of parliament that reduced the age limit to run for office in Nigeria. In a short while, Cynthia will help to lead our Q&A session with our colleague, Nick Cheeseman. Hey, Nick, how are you feeling today?
I'm great, thanks, Jeff. Really looking forward to this show.
Perfect, and me too. And actually, while we have you, I would love for you to please quickly tell our audience about the corresponding blog that you wrote for the show and how people can access it online.
Hi, everyone. Sure. Well, in my column for the Africa Report this month, I look at the question of young people in politics and ask the question, why is Africa getting more authoritarian if it's also getting younger? We every week have brilliant activists on the show who inspire us with their amazing efforts and bravery. And yet one of the things that struck me about looking at the survey data is that actually a lot of young people aren't as supportive of democracy or as willing to reject authoritarian alternatives as we might want. So I guess one of the things I'm really excited about today on the show is looking at that discrepancy, the brilliant sort of young people we see every week on the Resistance Bureau, and then the tension between that and the survey data, which suggests that people maybe aren't as invested in democracy as you might expect.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. And for those who are interested, again, you can see that blog on our website at theresistancebureau.com, but also on the Africa Report. So thanks again, Nick, for writing that and to sort of elaborate on many of the issues we'll be discussing today. And for our listeners, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Resist Bureau and use the hashtag Resist Bureau Live for today. And of course, for future shows. We are also live streaming on Facebook and on YouTube right now, and a recording for the show will be later distributed, and that will be available on Apple Podcasts. Before we turn to today's panel, I'll ask my co-host Mentade to set the scene for us, as someone who works in Zimbabwe and globally to help build the capacity of young people to meaningfully participate in democracy and governance processes. Mentade, please help us set the scene and give us a sense of what young people in Africa are experiencing today. I think you're on mute, Mentade. We're still having trouble hearing you. No, having some audio difficulties. So I think we'll give a second for Mentati to reload her screen here and see if she's able to get back online.
Hear me?
There we go. You're on.
Perfect. Thank you. That I would want to start off by saying they're the youngest continent in the world, and that's a very big one uses every time they're trying to challenge to see ourselves as stakeholders in the present. So you look at least 60% of the up to 25, and it is actually the case for the next couple of decades. Reflect on why that matters. So today and tomorrow have an effect we experience as young people today, and across countries and the continent is always divorced from the aspirations of the continent that is led by selfish children who do not understand what it is and therefore cannot lead because swayed by Western influence, being used to perpetuate violence with signistic roles that ensure that some necessarily influential. We've all people being made supporting acts for compromising our democracy. So there is a tide that we see that informs us has no shortage of crusading youth fighting for freedom and justice. In fact, featured here as speakers on the show, owning the truth that they are the stakeholders, the many obstacles that if people stand up and push back and approve that can be successful. So we saw the NSAS protests in Nigeria have been campaigning for decades against the but meaningful concessions from royal authority. The 2021 election opposition leader take up presidency up in huge numbers. In mobilize themselves on and offline for the government to account. The reflects on this, you'd actually expect that to a decrease in authoritarianism is actually happening. The content is moving away from democracy as in a bold and authoritarian shown up to a younger generation. This why is Africa getting more younger? What lessons can we draw that better explain the situation we need to make to ensure that Africa grows governance? Our panel is here to help the issue. And as the audience, you can share on Twitter, Facebook, comment section, message via WhatsApp on the number +7623819 on the screen right now, just in case you missed to draw in our panelists for the day.
Thank you so much, Mentati. I think you're having a bit of audio troubles. I'm seeing a lot of comments coming through, so maybe perhaps try to reload your stream here while we work on that. So thanks, folks, for letting us know about that. But Maxwell, if you're still with us and not experiencing audio or video troubles, we'd love to come to you first. Thank you so much again for joining us. It's really great to see you today. And we really wanted to bring you in first today because there's such a long and rich tradition of young people organizing and demanding change in Swaziland, which is now known as eSwatini after the country's name was changed by the king. And many of these movements we've seen over the years have been led by the student body and people at the university, which you for a long time were at the head of. So we wanted to ask you, what is distinctive about the strategies that students and Swazi youth such as yourself has spearheaded over the years? What makes your strategy sustainable? And perhaps more importantly, how do you constructively engage and build working relationships and build common values with the many varied elements that we know exist in the country's pro-democracy movement? We'd love your thoughts on that to kick us off today.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yeah, we can hear you perfect.
Okay, no, thank you very much for this opportunity to share with my colleagues and also the general public, on the young African authoritarianism in these particular instances in our continent. And we are very much excited to share about our lessons and experiences, as activists in eSwatini. I think you've already alluded in the beginning that Swaziland is one of the last remaining absolute monarchy in the country since 1973, when the right of every citizen was taken away. Hence, the people of eSwatini have been engaged in a long protected struggle, to regain their dignity, their humanity, as well as their independence or their right to elect their own government. But it hasn't been quite easy as people may think it has been. It has been a struggle against a regime that is brutal, a struggle against a regime that unleashes violence amongst activists, among students and youth leaders, for just
Maxwell, I think your audio has frozen. Are you still with us? All right, Peter, maybe we can switch to Joseph, our colleague from Zambia, if he's still on the line. Joseph, are you with us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can. Wow, we are having many issues today with our audio today, so apologies to our audience. Joseph, while we have you, maybe to segue from what Maxwell was discussing about the struggle in Swaziland, which I know you're very familiar with, we wanted to ask you, to sort of elaborate on some of the successes that you've been involved in, because so often we focus on the negative. So obviously we know that the Southern Africa region and really the continent writ large have been talking and really buzzing about the commendable youth turnout in 2021 in the Zambian election. So we wanted to ask you, what were the fundamentals that you believe led to that game-changing youth turnout, that game-changing youth participation that we all saw? And 1 year later, how have you and young people in the country, how have they upped their participation in civic and political processes, and how can that be sustained moving forward? Because obviously we know an election is just one event. So how can that momentum, how can that energy be sustained in Zambia and perhaps elsewhere in the years moving forward?
So what led to the higher turnout of the masses of our people, particularly the young people, for jobs, and they couldn't get those jobs, and so they
Joseph, we seem to have lost your audio. I'm not sure if you can still hear me, but maybe perhaps try switching off your video. Joseph, can you still hear us? Are you with us? All right, it looks like we have Maxwell back, so perhaps we can, Peter, go back to Maxwell and let him finish the question he was answering.
Well, thanks, Chef. I think I can still hear you as you make your inputs there. But I was still alluding, that you've been engaged in such a long protected struggle, to regain our human dignity and as citizens of these particular countries. And at the center of the struggle has been the youth and young people, in particular students, that have been organizing in tertiary institutions, in communities, conducting capacity building and civic education for the ordinary people in the communities and also the people in eSwatini to be interested and also to join, this movement for change in the kingdom of eSwatini. And it hasn't been easy, because even those pushful mobilization and grassroots campaigns and engagement have been met with violence, have been met with killings, jailings, and some even being forced, into foreign lands or even into hiding. So, but the trick has always been talk to our people in communities, lead campaigns that touches on the needs of people. The people, they don't have water, you must organize them around the issues of water, the issues of education in the tertiary institutions, but more in particular, even on the issues of social security services, because those are issues that touches the hearts and minds of our people, and you cannot organize them without engaging on those particular instances. So it has been already around grassroots mobilization, community engagement, civic educations, but as much as possible to always connect those small pieces of struggles of those people into one big campaign for social change as well as democratic reforms in the Kingdom of Swaziland.
Thank you so much, Maxwell. And Mentade, if you're back with us, we'd love to have you back here.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
I was going to just reference something that Maxwell mentioned has been ongoing for a very long time, and to ask a question, because in many cases you see that powerful or promising youth movement or ruling party ultimately really is, how have you and your colleagues at the Swaziland managed to maintain independence over the years in wider democracy movement?
Well, in Swaziland is a little bit of a different, scenario, like other African countries, because in the other African countries, there was the promise of liberation, from the colonizations, and then ushering of some pseudo-democracy or some pseudo-democratic reforms. But for us, we moved from colonizations into an absolute monarchy, that doesn't value anything that comes from young people or even from women in particular as well. So young people, they are just taken as things that cannot think, that cannot even contribute in the socio-economic and political participation of the people in Swaziland. So that has actually pushed the majority of young people into poverty, into isolation, into marginalizations, and giving us a fertile ground, to organize, young people for be able to play a particular role in the social economic dispensation in this particular instances in the country. But of course, young people and students in particular, they are one of the most contested, sectors of society in any democratic struggle or in any liberation struggle, because of their energy, because of their talent, but also because of a future that they could be able to play in the next breakthrough that will take place in that particular countries. So we have tried to instill values, values that will say they should talk into what the young people they want to see in the new democratic Swaziland, so that you do not just become cheerleaders and for those that will be only called, to mobilize and organize for elderly people to take positions, but young people to effectively participate in decision-making processes, to be involved, in spaces that will shape the destiny of this particular country, of this region, and also in this particular continent. So those are the values, and also of creating a new layer of leadership, people that are empowered, that are capacitated to be able to take serious responsibility into the new democratic dispensation. So I've always tried to instill, those particular values, so that it just goes beyond the color of your t-shirt, or it just goes beyond the partisan or polarization of politics, but we look it into the common national interest that seeks to liberate the country, to put in place a prosperous new democratic dispensation as a country moving forward.
Thank you so much, Maxwell. We're all, truly inspired by your efforts in the country. As you mentioned, and as many people watching today may not be aware of, Swaziland is actually Africa's last absolute remaining monarchy, and your struggle there has, gone up against immense obstacles that have been put in your way by royal authorities. So we thank you for your continued efforts there. And actually, it's a good segue, Joseph, if you're still with us, and your connection is okay. Can you hear us? Joseph, are you still with us? It seems like our colleague from Zambia is still working on his audio issues. It'd be great to get his insights, because obviously the Zambian example was such an inspiring one from the past few years. But with that said, perhaps we could go to our colleague from Zimbabwe, Joanna. We understand that you're on the line with us. Joanna, can you hear us? Joanna, we can see you, but we cannot hear you. Can you hear us? No, Joanna, we cannot hear you. We can see you though. Your video is clear. We just can't hear your audio. All right, let's try Joseph. Joseph, one more time. We can see you, but we can't hear you. Joseph, can you try saying something? All right, let's as our speakers work on their audio today. Nick, I think we're gonna have to come to you and Cynthia early. Obviously, we have Cynthia Ngumalu from Nigeria, who in her own right is an amazing activist who's worked on youth issues and pushing out the youth vote in Nigeria for many years. We noted some of her accomplishments at the outset, so we're really lucky to have her today. Nick, let's kick it over to you and see if we can salvage some of this for the moment.
Absolutely. Well, as you say, Jeff, we are very lucky, because Cynthia is not a great analyst and someone with great insights, but she's also someone who's been heavily involved at the coalface, as you said, in terms of the Not Too Young to Run campaign, which of course was really important, not only in asserting that young people to be political candidates in Africa, but also because it was successful. And of course, that's something that's really important. It's one thing to run a campaign, it's another thing to actually get the law changed. So Cynthia, it's a real honor and a pleasure for us to have you here. We've got a little bit more time than we might have thought otherwise. So first of all, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your own particular perspective on this, thinking perhaps about the context and not too young to run, but also then perhaps encouraging you to expand beyond that case and beyond Nigeria to think about where we are with young people and politics in Africa more broadly right now.
Thank you, and it's quite, I feel honored to be part of this conversation, and I hope you can hear me clearly. I think first I would start with the whole essence of this conversation. Why is this young continent getting a bit more authoritarian? But I would add another point. Why do we even have a tendency for the younger generation to almost want to look forward to or celebrate undemocratic change of government or unconstitutional change of government, or even feel comfortable with authoritarian rule? And I think I will, in this conversation, I want to begin with the whole idea of what's not too young to run. And for us, not too young to run is a bold statement that in a country like Nigeria, in a continent like Africa, where young people constitute a major percentage of its population, that such a continent or such a country should be blessed with the leadership of young people who constitute the larger percentage of its population. So the idea of not too young to run is a call to awaken the consciousness amongst young people within the continent that we cannot stay away from politics, we cannot stay away from leadership, because this is a time we actually need to take charge of leadership. And why is that very important for us as a people, as a continent? Is because When you think about the trend, if you think about the pro-democracy movement, now every generation, and I'll say this all sense of responsibility, every generation has its role to play to safeguard its democracy, because democracy in itself is not wishful thinking. The pro-democracy movement activists, if you think about the early 90s, also most of them were young people. If you go back to even the origin of a lot of countries in Africa, those who pushed for independence were within the youth age. Now, while we can have arguments around that, is that for every generation, they had the several battles that they had to fight. Now, for the generation of young people existing within this space, because the youth age is not a permanent, is not permanent. It is a transitional age. The question for a lot of young Africans, and the question for that we ought to respond to now, is at the time that we occupy this specific important age in our history, what battles do we want to pick? Do we want to focus in building a democratic continent that we can say that across the South and across the West and the East and the Central and the North, that we have democracy as a culture? And I would draw that into maybe lean a bit to the idea of Not Too Young to Run, the movement in Nigeria, and how I believe it's something that we need to consider within the continent. And I'll start simple at first. What happened? Why Not Too Young to Run? At the time, we had conducted an analysis of young people contesting for office. In 2015, Nigeria had the general elections, and we found out that there were young people who actually who contested elections, but the constitution limited the age to run for office. So if they had won the elections, they would have been ineligible to hold office because they were below the age requirement for those specific offices. And the question was, why would a constitution limit participation in a country where young people were over half of the population? Why should young people wait till they are 30 or 40 years old to run for president, or 30 to run for a state assembly? And then it raised a broader conversation. Why should we have a constitution limit participation in a democracy? And the question on Not Too Young to Run, I mean, the idea was build a movement around this issue. But to achieve that, we needed young people to understand the importance of leadership. Because first, if we want to organize and build a conscious generation of youth leaders, we need to first start from the point of awareness and building that consciousness around the value of democracy. And I think for a lot of young people, this is the dilemma we saw in Nigeria. For the young people in Nigeria, a lot of them did not have a lot of a memory about the military regime that we had for a long period of time. Some of them did not really experience the hostility and the horrible experience of living within a military regime. So for them, democracy was just based on what they understood. And while our democracy is not perfect, there was this idea of this system is not working. Can we get the military back? Now, when people are ignorant of the past, there is a tendency to romanticize over an idea because they did not experience that. We needed to first sell the idea of democracy, that democracy actually works when people engage. And these are the values of democracy. So first, creating that awareness to get people involved was to build the consciousness around the value of democracy. So it was beyond just getting a hashtag to trend. It also young people to understand the value of participation and why it matters in a democracy and why participation is key for any democracy to be sustained. And that was the first part, getting people to understand the importance of participation. The other thing was organizing around our issues beyond identities. Now, why did I bring in identities? Because I think this is also a dilemma, not just within the country, because the youth age, this is a heterogeneous category of persons. We all exist with several identities: the ethnic, the religious, there's the racial, there is also the gender dynamics, there's also the sexual orientation dynamics, and the political. So there's a lot of identities here. And within this new generation, there is also a mix of two generations, the millennials and the Gen Zs, who are, I mean, we all have different orientations. So we needed to first build a message around a common identity. And the focus was the identity of a generation who needed to see change in leadership. It wasn't just about youth, because you don't want people who were in their early 30s or late 30s to feel disconnected from that. If you go strictly to definition of youth, or those who were just in their early 20s to say, oh, this is the fight for the older generation. We wanted people to understand that it's beyond your age. It's about a generation, and it's about the time we occupy in this space. So the common focus was we're building an identity around the younger generation who believes it's time for them to take on leadership. But while building that common identity, it was also important to recognize that we're still different and diverse people. So the fact that you're Christian or Muslim, or you have a different political affiliation, does not mean you do not belong to the movement, because this movement is beyond those other identities. And why is identity important, especially in a country like Africa, where we have a lot of diversities? And because one of the things we're learning is, if we really want to organize successfully to overthrow authoritarian leadership, we need to identify an identity that does not necessarily undermine those other sensitive identities, but recognizes it while fostering a unified one. Why? Because people are very sensitive about who they are, where they come from, and what they care about. So if we undermine and belittle that, they would get to a point where there is a conflict. And we don't want to get to a point where there is a conflict, because what have we learned from the political class? The one tool the political class has learned in undermining the power of movement is manipulating the differences that exist. So the fault lines begin to begin to show up. And before you know it, we are focusing on the differences in identity rather than on the issues. So for us, Not Too Young to Run was forging an identity that did not disregard the other sensitivities that exist, but recognizes that while pushing a common message. So which is why the issue and the identity are important to go together. That while we may have several differences, these are the issues. Now, our common suffering is the issue that connects us. And that was one of the things that made Not Too Young to Run successful, that young people from different parts of the country, Nigeria is very diverse, multi-religious, with over 200 ethnic groups, political differences, but we had young people across different party lines, across the regional lines and religious lines, connecting to the movement and pushing for the amendment of the constitution. And I believe that was one of the things that led to the success of that constitutional amendment, that at the time we were pushing for it, we understood we had different identities, but our issues were common, that we're young people and we have common sufferings, be it lack of education or lack of access to power, lack of access to opportunities, and the host of others, insecurity and the host of others. And we believe that if we had people who looked like us in government, that perhaps we'll start seeing things change in the way leadership was being administered or dealt with. So that for me is a major lesson that we learn. And if I want to even push that to the NSAS movement, if for those who follow the NSAS, at the time the NSAS movement, when the movement was out in the streets, the idea was we understood that we had different identities. But at the time, the message was to an end to police brutality. So there were pictures at the point where we had our Muslim brothers and sisters who had to pray, and the Christians who were the protest ground created and provided safety for them to say their prayers and then join back the protest. So it was not. It was important for us, for the movement, for Not Too Young to Run, to recognize these identities, because the moment we begin to agree that we have differences, it is easier for us to forge a common agenda without being vulnerable to the political class who would want to manipulate those identities. But what were some of the things that we started to learn also? That even when we organize as young people, there would always be dissenting voices and opposing voices. But the truth is, for every movement and as a generation, we cannot act like the older generation who would do everything possible to shut down opposing voices or dissenting voices. Because the idea of democracy is that diverse voices can speak and still agree on issues. And why it's important.
Yeah, let me come in and ask you a quick question, because you're talking about, that the manipulation that can occur from older figures, wealthier figures, An academic, William Reno, did a study of Nigeria. One of the things that he argued was that a lot of the groups that start off kind of challenging power, looking like they want to bring about a bigger, kind of more transformative change in Nigerian politics from below, especially young groups, often get to a certain level and then they basically get co-opted. They get bought into an existing political movement, they get bought into an existing party, maybe the leaders get plucked out, and things fall apart. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, kind of Not Too Young to Run, but also NSAS, of course, protests against police brutality, but also a wider set of issues in Nigeria that young people are at the forefront of. How do you prevent key figures, key people, key aspects of that getting co-opted and brought into government, into lucrative positions, and therefore the kind of movement constantly being subverted from above? How do you stop that happening?
The truth is, it's always going to be difficult because one, for those who occupy power, the state is powerful. And if you fight against a powerful structure like the state in every country, you would always get a lot of people, a retaliation and infiltration. One of the things we learned for Not Young to Run was when it came to the leadership structure, we invested in a decentralized, diverse structure. Why? It's not centered around one or two or three individuals. Why is this important? Because as movements evolve, there is a likelihood for one or two persons who are seen as the heads or the faces of the movement to be easily corrupted. And the idea is, if you have a decentralized structure, you cannot corrupt everyone, right? There would always be those who understand that this is a movement beyond the immediate benefit. So for the movement, for Not Too Young to Run, Nigeria is a federal state. At the federal, at the state level, at the local level, there were leaders leading the movement. So it would take a very devious, demonic individual to want to corrupt the leadership structures at different levels. So I think one thing we're beginning to learn is we need to organize better. So leadership is key, but there should be a sense of leadership, but diverse, decentralized, and clarity of roles. Because if there is no clarity, anyone could come in and take over. And then who represent? When I talk about diversity, it was important for us that for everyone speaking for the movement, that people from different parts of the country can connect to that individual. So for the Nigerian context, regional balance, religious inclusion, gender was important, and even disability, because you want a sense that this is not a one-sided movement. And I think this is something we need to begin to learn, that as we evolve and as we build movements who serve as resilience against authoritarian leadership, that we must intentionally invest in building leadership across board and having that diversity in those and the faces who speak for the movement. What matters, because most times it's a worry around if it's decentralized, then who controls it? There's always that worry. For us, what we learned was focus on having unified message. So there's clarity on the communication and the messaging, but as many as possible, let's have different individuals speaking for the movement. That's where it is difficult to identify one or two persons that would be used as an entry point to infiltrate the movement.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think that's a brilliant response. And thanks to Robert, who messaged there to agree with you. We've got hopefully some of our speakers back. So I'm going to push back to Jeff now, who's going to go off and hopefully complete some of those interviews. And then Cynthia will come back to you for a final word at the end. But thanks so much for those important insights. Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thanks so much, Cynthia. I thought that was brilliant. I think the fact that Nigeria is such a richly diverse country, and the fact that you work in that environment as a youth activist and as a youth organizer really offers so many lessons for folks that are listening today. So we're going to try one more time. Joanna, we think you're with us. Can you hear us okay?
Hi, Jeff. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you properly.
Wonderful. I think there's a bit of a delay, but thank you so much for your best efforts to join us today. We know that you've had a very hectic day. You spent the day in court yet again, which you can, I'm sure, tell our listeners about. But we really wanted to get your insights on some of the key issues you've been working on. As many of our listeners know, today, you're the youngest member of Zimbabwe's parliament. So we thought you'd have some unique insights into many of the issues we'd be delving into. And despite your many accomplishments,
Jeffrey, I can't hear you. Jeffrey, I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Yes, please, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. We wanted to ask you about the routine persecution that you faced in Zimbabwe. We wanted you to lay out, if you could, the harsh realities that this dynamic presents to you and how it perhaps affects your ability and willingness to participate in civic and political spaces. But also, relatedly, you know, surely we'll have many people listening today who are young people in Zimbabwe, many young women. What advice would you give to them who might, on the one hand, be interested in joining politics, but who have surely, on the other hand, seen the abuse that you and others have suffered? We would love your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you, the Resistance Bureau, for inviting me to be part of this inspiring panel. Can you hear me, Jeff?
Loud and clear, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe I'll just tackle your question in two segments to say that first, I'll share my experiences as one of the young people in Zimbabwe. We've been fighting the authoritarian regime that we've had since 1980, and also a bit about our Zimbabwean context, so that you understand also how the young people here have been contributing to the fight against the authoritarian regime. So in my own understanding and view, I personally think that sometimes we assume that young people understand the issues, they understand the challenges facing or they're faced with, and how they're supposed to tackle those challenges in their different countries, especially when we speak about democracy and authoritarianism. So here is my background as a young politician in Zimbabwe. I started my political journey when I was just 19 years old, when I joined the students' movement, the Zimbabwe National Students Union. So this gave me an added advantage being in the students' movement, because it gave me a platform, a space to think critically, to be able to challenge the status quo, to be able to question, you know, certain issues that I felt that were proper in my country. So whereas most of the young people in Zimbabwe, they've not been engaged, or they've not been involved in governance at a very tender age. So difference there. So because of my experiences in the students' movement, it gave me this, it gave me a platform to be able to stand up or to speak, you know, and represent my generation. So because of this role that I've been playing in the Students' Board before moving into the mainstream politics in 2018, I find it very useful that I was able to mobilize young, female students in tertiary institutions to be able to voice up, to be able to speak out, and to be able to represent themselves in, in challenges probably that were affecting them. So because of this platform, I think it also gave me, it put me at a very great risk with the regime that was there in 2012, for example, the Mugabe era. And this has never stopped from then, since, the Mugabe government moving to the Emerson Mnangagwa authoritarian regime. So you have seen that the persecution that I faced when I was a student leader and the persecution that I'm still facing now is almost the same. And probably now it has become sophisticated and even worse. So what you are seeing in Zimbabwe, the context of Zimbabwe is that the authoritarian regime is born out of a liberation struggle. What do I mean by that? I mean to say that in Zimbabwe, we hold elections. For example, next year in 2023, we're actually preparing to get to the general election to hold another general elections. But when we look in the past elections that we have had in Zimbabwe, we see that all these elections have been disputed to the extent that right now in the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe, we have a case whereby Morgan Richard Tsvangirai the late is an applicant in a Supreme Court, and Robert Mugabe is a respondent. But this case happened in 2002, but there's never been judgments pertaining to these disputed elections. So what we see is that there's lack of will to actually address, these challenges that we face, because the regime does not actually care. What they want is to hold elections just as a ritual, so that they get legitimacy to say there is democracy in Zimbabwe when we actually do not have democracy. Then also, the history of Zimbabwe has been marred with a lot of political violence. When you look at the political violence that happened in the southern region of Zimbabwe, popularly known as Gukurahundi, so that past violence, it has actually deterred a lot of young people in participating in today's politics or civic spaces, because they fear, to say, if this happened, and it has not been resolved, what about today? What about now? So there's that gap whereby we see that the regime does not care about the healing strategy, about addressing, the past violence that has happened in this country. Then also we look at the current violence that is happening in the country. For example, I've been a victim of political violence since my days in the students' movement since 2012. In actual fact, I was first arrested when I was only 20 years old, which is very, abnormal. But in a context like Zimbabwe, we have tended to normalize the abnormal. We have actually become comfortable with the pre-trial detentions, with the abductions, with the torture and so forth. So what we have seen is that the current authoritarian rule is using a lot of violence to scare away young people to participate in political spaces. So for example, we have the Central Intelligence Organization in Zimbabwe that is supposed to be investing probably in financial intelligence and actually protecting the citizens. But what they have done is the regime has used the state apparatus to make sure that they execute violence on young people in Zimbabwe. So with all this background, you see that a lot of young people would not want to participate because of this kind of violence. And of course, coming into the 2017 that happened on the 17th of November, you see, when we saw the heavily involvement of military in solving what I want to call the leadership dispute in the ruling party, because this was a ruling party politics, but we saw the involvement of military. And since then, we have seen that military has never left the politics of Zimbabwe. They're heavily involved. And in actual fact, the ruling elite is using military to make sure that they execute also violence on young people and general citizens in this country. So all these factors, you find that they scare away young people into participating in the fight for democracy. Then, of course, we see a lot of infiltration in different organizations, particularly those that are trying to fight authoritarianism in Zimbabwe, be it in churches, be it the student movements, civic society, and so forth, just to mention a few. So you find that there are elements, that are used to infiltrate these organizations, so as a way to silence and to actually shut down these, few democratic spaces that we have in Zimbabwe. So all these factors are being used in Zim. I'm giving this background so that we critically understand the characteristic and form of the authoritarian rule that we have in this country. Then, of course, What we have seen also in Zimbabwe is the executive tyranny, whereby there hasn't been a separation of power from executive, judiciary, and legislature. What we have seen, we've actually seen a lot of victimization on legislators. In 2020, we've witnessed parliamentarians being recalled from their duties, being recalled from parliament. So you see that there is actually no separation of powers when it comes to the executive. It's like the executive is running the show. It's running in the legislative arm. It's also running in the judiciary. What we have seen, we have also seen the Chief Justice being actually, his contract being extended with the amendment of a constitution. So all these factors, it gives, it reduces the hope, it discourages young people into participating in the fight for democracy or in the fight against authoritarian rule in our country. So all these factors are being used in Zimbabwe. But of course, has the hope been lost? What I want to say is that the more they pounce on us young people, the more that they come to us is the more that we get energy to fight this authoritarian rule. But how do we do that in a context like Zimbabwe? I want to take a leaf from what Cynthia mentioned to say that we have to be organized as young people in Zimbabwe. We have to make sure that we educate ourselves, we invest in research, we invest in critical thinking, we invest in proffering alternative solutions so that we can educate each other to say, okay, this is the right path to take, and that's how we can actually challenge. But of course, you've also asked about my own experiences, the times that I've stayed in prison, the times that I've been, abducted and tortured, the times I've even spent in courts. Like you've rightly mentioned, today I spent my time in court on a charge of breaking lockdown regulations. And to tell you this, Jeff, I spent 62 days with my colleagues, Cecilia Chimbiri and Nesai Marova, in the maximum security prison on a charge of breaking COVID regulations. So imagine if, for example, if I had committed, that crime, to say, okay, I broke the lockdown regulations, for example, does that amounting in prison for 62 days. So if I count the times that I've been, emotionally and physically abused, it's really been difficult for me. It has taken a heavy toll on my part. But also at the end of the day, I want to take this quote by one of the people that I look up to, Mama Winnie Madikizela, when she said, I am the product of my enemy. There is no longer anything that I fear. There is nothing that this government has not done to me. There is no pain that I have not known. So the point that I've reached as an individual is to say, I am more resilient than ever. And I even want to encourage even young people around Africa, young people in Zimbabwe, is to say that this is the critical time that we need to be more resilient than before. Why do we need to be more resilient than before? Why? It's because that the system that we are fighting, we're not fighting an individual here. We are fighting a sophisticated system. We are fighting an authoritarian regime. And also this authoritarian regime, it has resources on its end. For example, Emerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa controls all the key sectors of the economy. They control the fuel, they control agriculture, they've actually monopolized every, key sectors of this economy. So this is the reason why as young people, we need also to be very sophisticated. We need to organize ourselves. We need to educate. We need to inform so that we are able to act against this this regime. So as young people, we need to we ought to act, but definitely in a constitutional manner and also in a peaceful manner. So that's what I think we can do as young people in Zimbabwe, and this is how we have been contributing to the fight against the regime in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You speak so passionately, and I'm very proud of you, because it's really great to see young people like you about, Zimbabwe, both in terms of where we are from and where we want to go as young people. What you did for us is lay a good foundation of things in Zimbabwe, which I guess comes conversation today to say, where do we send our young people play? And you highlighted a couple of things that you've done to ensure that young people push back young democracy. So I wanted to speak into the coming elections in Zimbabwe, because in Zimbabwe, about how young people are increasing political conversations, but you find that a lot of not necessarily translate to them participate 26 by-elections that happened in Zimbabwe. Voter turnout, young people, and I have for you really is, how do you see this dynamic out as we grow towards the 2023 elections? This is like the Citizen Coalition for Change in this dynamic, in order to ensure that we have in actual political processes.
Tante, can you please come again? I didn't quite get your question.
Okay,
can you hear me, Mantante? Please come again. Yes.
Yes, I was saying, I was referencing the 3 elections that you highlighted in your submission. In a concern that young people in Zimbabwe involved in political processes online, for instance, Facebook and other social media platforms, but that to young people participating in processes. A good example, obviously, being the March 26 elections, few young people showing up to vote. So my question is to see this panning out as we lead up to the 2023, see parties like yours, the CCC, contributing so that we have young people participating both online.
Thank you, Mantante. Of course, the line is breaking, but from what I'm getting is that you're asking basically on what our party, the Citizens Coalition for Change, is doing in mobilizing young people to register to vote, something like that.
Correct.
Okay, yes. So what we have done as Citizens Coalition for Change, we have a new strategy as a party. And what is this strategy? The strategy is to bring the citizens to the center, is to put the citizens first in everything that we do. And where do we locate the young people in all this? So what I would want to say is that, yes, we have a dark cloud in Zimbabwe. Yes, we have an authoritarian rule in Zimbabwe, but has all hope been lost? Definitely no. We still have hope for a new great Zimbabwe. So what we have done is that a Citizens Coalition for Change, we are organizing young people to be on the center of pushing back authoritarian rule. And how are we doing this? We are doing this by encouraging young people to go out and register to vote. And how are we doing this to encourage young people? We are using new mechanisms. For example, we are using the social media. And I think you have seen, our different social media campaigns where we are talking about 1 million new young people to go out and register to vote. So how are we attracting these 1 million new young people to go out and register to vote? We are engaging different key stakeholders in Zimbabwe. For example, the artists. I'm sure you've been seeing a lot of young artists coming out in open to encourage, young people to go out and register to vote. That's one aspect that we are also doing. So in short, we have chosen, different key stakeholders in each and every sector. So be it the arts industry, for example, in the churches, in the business sector, in the informal traders. So we have tried to identify key players in all these different sectors so that they can speak the same language that their fellow young people understand. Because we have seen that our strategy back then, whereby, you know, we take someone from the business, for example, to go and encourage people or young people in the informal sector to go out and register to vote, or to encourage them in governance, does not work. So now we are employing new mechanisms, and this new mechanism is by putting citizens at the center. All these strategies that we are coming up with, we are involving the citizens themselves, because what we have realized is that there is strength in people power than people in power. So what we want is to make sure that we have people power in Zimbabwe. The citizens themselves are well organized. The citizens have the power. So this is the task that we have. So young people obviously must also understand that they have the responsibility to push the authoritarian regime. They have a responsibility to push back the authoritarian rule. So we also need to understand our mission as a generation. So this is what I said in my opening remarks, to say sometimes
well, sadly, it looks like Joanna has cut out again. We'll try to get to her before we end the show, but Maxwell, we'd love to bring you back in here to help us close out a bit before we go back to Nick and Cynthia for some final thoughts. Are you still with us? Can you hear us okay?
Yes, Jeff, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me as well.
Wonderful. Yes, thanks for sticking with us. So obviously for listeners and people who watch this show regularly, one element that we really like to focus on in many of our shows, including this one, is the theme of solidarity. You know, the notion that we're all in this together, that solidarity knows no boundaries. And I just got a text message from Joseph Kalimbwe, our speaker from Zambia, who unfortunately kept dropping off. And he wrote to me on this issue. And then Maxwell, I wanted to ask you a similar question. But Joseph says that solidarity is important because we need, as young Africans, to share ideas on how to defeat authoritarianism. In Zambia specifically, we united in common purpose to take our country back from an authoritarian leader. And we wanted to put in power a new leader with sound vision that will lead us into the future. But he says the Zambian story alone is not enough. This is not enough until other Africans win their struggles against oppression. To do that, we must share ideas across borders in ways and means with which to defeat those who seek to destroy our countries. So Maxwell, to really delve into this a bit, if you have 2 to 3 minutes to sort of elaborate on this. You know, this issue of solidarity is very clear in your work as well. I've seen that through some of the work you've done with colleagues in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and elsewhere across Southern Africa. So what is your personal basis for taking this approach? Why is solidarity important to you? And if you could give us a sense of how more young activists in Africa and elsewhere, those who might be listening today, how can they be empowered to follow your lead, to reclaim those key symbols of solidarity that Joanna was actually just talking to, things such as Pan-Africanism? How can they retake that as the rallying cry for freedom and dignity? We would love your thoughts on that.
No, thank you very much, Jeff. And I think I want to allude on the question of solidarity. That is one of the key components, of the struggle, against authoritarian regimes, as well as the shrinking democratic space in SADC, as well as in the African continent. Because, if you trace solidarity, it comes back even during the liberation struggle, during colonialization. You remember that Lusaka used to be the headquarters of most liberation movements in Africa, where they could get support, financial resources, to pursue their struggle for national liberation. So even now, when you talk about SADC being, a big brothers, league within the SADC of the states, because of some of those entrenchments of solidarity that they shared during their liberation struggles. But of course, you cannot win the struggle on an isolated cases, because the challenges facing young people in Swaziland are relatively similar to the challenges facing young people in a democratic South Africa, in a military junta in Zimbabwe, or as well as other African countries, where young people, they're constantly marginalized, they're constantly victimized, they're constantly, brutalized for just wanting to participate in the socio-economic and political participation of this nation. So the issue of solidarity, it allows us to connect our struggles, our connection of our experiences as well as lessons, to be able to lead the movement that will not only just change Zimbabwe or Zambia alone, but it must also be able to change the SADC region and the continental region, because we do not just want to be happy about what happened in Zimbabwe or in Zambia. We want to see the people of Zambia or of Zimbabwe, reclaiming their freedom and their liberation and rebuild their economy, so that it creates opportunities for us. Because Agenda 2063 by the African Union cannot be achieved when other regimes, they are shrinking or backsliding in terms of democracy, when the economies of other African countries are not doing well. So we are going to continue to go and point ourselves into South Africa, leading into xenophobia. So it's important that we connect our struggles and we assist each other with the common purpose of building a strong solidarity movement that will resist the backsliding democracies, that will resist the economic, downturn of the taking place in the African continent, that will resist the corruption, the illicit financial flows, that will also resist, the climate change, deterioration that is taking place around the continent. So that can only be done by a strong youth movement that is connected all over the African continent in our diversity, so that we could be able to bring about change, a change that is sustainable, and a change that will create opportunities for young people, regardless of their race and also in their countries that they come from.
Thank you so much, Maxwell. Really appreciate that insight. We have a few minutes left, and Nick, if you're still with us, and Cynthia, we wanted to kick this over to you to help us close out today's show.
Great. Thanks so much, Maxwell. It's great to hear some fantastic insights, even though we've had the technical challenges today. Cynthia, coming to you for the final word. I guess one of the things that I thought might be useful for us to talk a little bit about, that maybe we haven't said so much about so far, is, where does the idea that, young people are particularly challenged, in Africa come from? We've had an interesting question come in while the debate's been going about, is this a global thing? Aren't young people marginalized everywhere? Aren't young people frustrated everywhere? Historically, we've talked about it being a bit different in Africa because of the idea that there's a kind of gerontocratic society that venerates age. Leaders are expected to be older. Young people are not seen to have reached elder status, and therefore are not seen to have, the kind of experience that's necessary to be a leader, and that creating a kind of barrier. But it would be great maybe for our listeners to hear, from your perspective, is there any difference between being a young person in Nigeria and a young person anywhere else? Do you feel that, you are more or less respected as a result of your age? How does that play out, and how does that shape all of the things that we've been talking about today? So over to you for the last word, and then we'll go back to Jeff and Mentali to take it home.
I do agree that in different parts of the world, if you think about the age of leadership, there's a likelihood that in even developed democracies, you have older leaders. But why Africa is peculiar is that, first, we said it already, this is a young continent. This is a continent where young people constitute the majority of its population. And this is the continent that will still be experiencing population growth in years to come, based on the projections by the United Nations. So because of that, there is that need for young people to not just reclaim their place in leadership, but to be identified and seen as equal partners in development. And why we must work towards that is because, like you said, our traditions and cultures and even folk tales re-emphasize the importance of reverence to age, to the older generation. But if we let that trend continue, what would happen is that a population, a continent with a large youth population will continually be denied the benefits of youth leadership if young people are kept out of the space. Now, what makes Africa more important? Look at the trends. Young people are looking for better opportunities outside the continent. Young people do not feel that they are part of the system. And what happens when you do not harness this energy within the youth population is that young people begin to feel disconnected from a nation where they do not believe they are properly represented, and it becomes easier to take up arms against the state. It becomes easier to see the state as an enemy rather than a partner. So for Africa, it is important that young people take the rightful place in leadership, because we're not just the future, we are the leaders of today. And beyond that, because of our peculiarities, a lot of the nations in this continent are still developing and dealing with lots of challenges that the older generation do not have the innovation to address. So we need to get in the ideas of young people into leadership. And just to round up, what I would say for young people across the continent, we need to understand that this is our fight as a generation, the fight for democracy in the continent. Now, while Africa is a beautiful, big, wonderful continent, the beauty of this continent can only be experienced if young people organize across the board in our respective countries to reinvent democracy and reclaim power by instituting democratic leadership led by a majority of young people. But we need to be able to stand firm to challenge power, because the older generation will not easily hand over to us. Power it wouldn't just give it to us on a platter. We need to get back and understand that we have a role to play in building our continent, that the Western world cannot help us here. We African youth, we are the answers and the solutions to the problem of Africa. And as we organize and plan, there would always be attacks to young people. The authoritarian leaders would not want to step aside because they love to stay and hold on to power. So we cannot also sit back and expect them to step aside. So what must we do for every election? We must approach every election as a battle. First, we need to define our identity. We need to organize around our issues, and we need to unify our messages. And our strategy for every election must be to find how we support younger people to win elections, younger people to take over leadership, and younger people to actually vote. Because when we leverage on our numeric strength, we can challenge political power by influencing political outcome. But we need to first organize this population, and then we can have the numerical strength. We can truly say we have a numerical strength to challenge the current powers that exist. That is the only way we can take over the continent, by organizing better, by building our structures better, but ensuring that we do not step aside and stay back and let these leaders to take over, because that is the only way we can get the kind of change that we want to see.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think that's a really brilliant call to arms and a really inspiring way to end the show. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to send us back to Jeff Amantali.
Thanks so much, Nick. And thank you so much, Cynthia and Maxwell, Joanna, Joseph. Thanks for sticking with us today, our audience. We know we had some audio and technical difficulties, and we appreciate you staying with us. Of course, in an ideal circumstance, we would have loved for this conversation to go on, but we're certainly keep in touch with all of our speakers we had on the show today. And as it stands now, time does not permit us to continue, so we have to close the show. And of course, you know, our team at the Resistance Bureau looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you, to highlighting the important work that you do moving forward. You truly inspire each of us, and thanks again for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. Also, please stay in touch with us by visiting our website, theresistancebureau.com, and by subscribing on our homepage to get updates on the program, as well as show summaries and participant videos, which will be coming through this week. On our website, you can also revisit all of our past shows, all of which are saved and free to download in the episodes section. You can also search for us on Apple Podcasts to download our shows there, so you can listen anytime. Of course, as many of you found out about us, we are also on Twitter, on Facebook, but we also have pages on Instagram and YouTube. We have all the bases covered. As a final note, the continued impact of this program is a real testament to the efforts of our entire team. Big thanks, as always, to our tech manager, who really had his hands full today, Peter Dory, to our creative director, Ndondo Msaka, who makes all of our images for the show, which are always fantastic. They both work behind the scenes to make the Resistance Bureau a real success. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Stay safe in the meantime. Please keep fighting those good fights, keep inspiring, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.